I'm just gonna make a quick video here. I got two new books I bought and then one from the library, and specifically the one from the library is amazing. I've been reading it. It's the Autobiography of John Cournos, and a little bit about Cournos. He was I think born in 1882. He was born in Russia, and when he was 10 moved to the United States, to Philadelphia, and so he learned English there, and he eventually moved to the UK, and then I think back to America. But he was in the Imagist poetry movement. He knew Ezra Pound and all those folks, and he actually had some poetry published in the poetry magazine that you can read online if you're interested. Another thing he did that he was pretty well known for was he was the first translator for Petersburg by Belly, and you can still buy that translation. But he also wrote novels. He published a trilogy of autobiographical novels from 1919 to 1922. And those you can find on the Internet Archive. But this here, his autobiography, was published in 1935. And it's really awesome. And one interesting thing I found in here from the library, this book, they must have bought, like, this school library must have bought this book in 1935, because there's a pencil mark 6136. Someone in 1936 checked this book out and read it. And I suppose that's always obvious in older books like this, that someone must have bought it and put it somewhere. But just the fact that someone wrote it on there, it makes it more real. And then there's January 26, 1939, November 28th, 1939, August 13th of 1942. It's like, oh man, some people were reading this way back then. And I've read about a third of it today, and I just wanted to read a couple like really good sections. This one I thought was super funny. My effort to accustom myself to English had its amusing side. A child learns to speak phonetically, and the language I heard about me did not predispose me to learn as I should. Thus it is that an immigrant learns to say "Gerar here," when "get out of here" is meant. "What's the matter with you?" when "what's the matter with you" is intended. Many words I caught by ear had indeed no meaning at all to me, and I used them afterward with absurd, sometimes entertaining effects. As, for example, when I addressed a boy who was particularly friendly to me with what was, in the circumstances, a droll phrase: "You goddamn bastard, you son of a bitch, what the hell are you doing today?" I was rather astonished to observe the friendly expression vanish from his face as the boy approached me menacingly. "What did you say?" he asked, pushing his face towards mine. "What did I say?" I stammered, realizing I had said something I shouldn't have. "Don't you know?" he asked, while a note of perplexity crept into his menace. "No," I explained, "but I had heard so-and-so say it to so-and-so, and he apparently didn't mind." "You called my mother a whore," he said, and went on to elucidate the meaning of the phrase. Naturally, I felt abashed, and I mumbled an apology. Yet it is quite true, I heard boys address each other friendly with oaths and obscenities. Later I was to hear grown men do the same thing. Indeed, many, many years later, when I was a young man, I held an editorial position in a Philadelphia newspaper. The city editor and the star reporter addressed each other in the most blankety-blank epithets of a very diverse and artistic nature. And this out of sheer friendliness. Neither would have felt it dignified to address an enemy in like fashion. Swearing, like any other expression can be an art. But like any art, it requires imagination. And then, let's see. Oh yeah, here's what I was looking at here. Okay. So he's talking about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow here. Longfellow's poetry didn't make life appear real at all, whereas real life in the street was the very thing that made Longfellow's lines seem unreal to us. I have often pondered on this. After all, if I told the man sitting across the table from me that my life was real and my life was earnest, he'd have every reason for pondering what precisely I meant by it, and he'd have every justification for thinking me, to put it mildly, a bit vague and something of a solemn prig. Certainly I should fail to impress him with any feeling of my life being real or earnest, meaningless adjectives, because they fail to convey any sense of life. If, on the other hand, I said to him that life was a plain bitch, he might, if he were squeamish, think the expression somewhat coarse, but at least he'd understand what I intended to convey. You cannot reduce life, even in poetry, to abstract adjectives. But then a man who feels life would not express himself as Longfellow expressed himself in the innocuous verse I was called upon to recite in school after arduous afternoons of real life in the streets. Poetry had been defined by Wordsworth as emotion recollected in tranquillity. I am afraid that much of Longfellow's poetry is tranquillity recollected in tranquillity. And in the sphere of poetry there is no disappointment greater than that of really finding a sheep in sheep's clothing. The latter phrase I must attribute to Mr. W.B. Yeats, who applied it to a living poet of considerably greater stature than Longfellow, but I must forbear mentioning his name. And then, let's see which... Oh yeah, here, okay. Yet now, looking backward, I see that I did want something, and that what I wanted is not so different from what I want today. For in that mad welter of life, my life, there was one idea deep down and striving to come to the surface. The idea of happiness. By happiness I do not mean the romantic schoolgirl's idea of bliss on earth. By all means let the romantic schoolgirl go for it, if that is what she wants. That too is happiness of sorts. I rather mean the happiness that comes of oneself, and of complete expression of oneself. To have shelter, food, work of your choice, the woman you want, and who wants you equally, the sky and the grass. What else can one desire? Yet in this complex world the simplest things seem the most unattainable. Civilization has created a jungle of machines in which the struggle for existence is fiercer than in any jungle created by nature. Human beings need adventure too, yet for the average man there is less adventure today in circumnavigating the globe in a magnificent liner than in making a short journey in a stagecoach 100 years ago, say from London to Hastings or from New York to Philadelphia. To doctrinaires it may sound like a heresy to say that the Great War was instigated as much by the tedium suffered by the masses as by the machinations of imperialist nations. But even heresies have their measure of truth. And then, let's see, there was... Well, I think that's a good sample anyway. But yeah, I've been loving reading this autobiography. I had to order it. I'm reading it from the library now. It was in storage. It wasn't checked out since like 1978 or something last. But really enjoying it. And then the other two books I got, one is called I Burn Paris by Bruno Jasienski. He's Polish. It's published in 1928. And I think it got him kicked out of France, actually, because it talks about a plague going through France and Paris, and then a bunch of people start revolutions and start burning everything. And I Burn Paris. I haven't read it yet, but it does seem very interesting. And then the second one I got is Adam Buenos Aires. And this one is compared in the introduction to Joyce, Ulysses, and Dublin's Berlin Alexanderplatz, and also Manhattan Transfer by Dos Passos. So that's of course a good sign there. And then this author, Leopoldo Marechal, was also friends with Borges. In the 1920s, they were all in the same Argentine literary groups in Buenos Aires. And apparently he put Borges as a character in here, along with several of his other literary friends at the time. So I'm looking forward to that. I've only read the introduction so far, which it's a fairly extensive introduction, because this is called a critical edition, so it has a bunch of notes and 40-page introduction. So I've been enjoying that. But yeah, I just wanted to make a short video talking about John Cournos, because it's such a good autobiography. It's such a good autobiography. So I recommend it if you can get a hold of it.